Have you ever wondered why the story across the 2.x patches feels so inconsistent? And on top of that, how Wuthering Waves is actually developed? These two questions are tightly connected. In this video, I'll tackle both. What kind of unique, brutal constraints Wuthering Waves has been under, and why that led to so many plot inconsistencies, with 6 concrete examples. As everyone knows, one of the most complained about issues in 2.6 Part 1 is Lupa's complete absence. While this is slightly patched over in a basically acceptable way through few lines from characters and NPCs in Septimont, it still feels strange that in 2.4, Rover and Leviathan have been fighting in Septimont for a whole day, and yet Augusta and Yuno somehow neither notice nor step in to help. Because according to the plot, it is in the morning when Lupa sets off on her new storyline after Rover delivered a powerful blow against Leviathan, and she only comes back at dusk. At this point, some fellow players might push back. Come on, it's just a gacha game, don't overthink the story. Well, to me, the thing is, the only reason I'm even talking about this is because Kuro clearly wants Wuthering to be a AAA game. Others might say, these are minor issues, as long as Kuro does a bit better next time, it's fine. They can just leave some hooks or foreshadowing between patches, and it'll all be okay. Well, unless it won't. The core problem isn't minor at all, it's a structural flaw buried inside the current development pipeline. You will also see how this was laid out in the examples. Okay, so let's break down the causes along 2 lines, and then we'll look at the evidence. Thread A, top down, not enough time. In an ideal world, if you adapt a finished story into a game and everyone does their job properly, you almost never get this kind of severe front-to-back inconsistency. But UA, or more broadly, most live service long-running games on the market simply don't have that luxury. They have to build in some buffer and then write the story as updates go out. From dev interviews in 2024, it sounds like Wuthering originally has readied around 2 years of fairly detailed main story content. But once the public test went live, the negative feedback was so intense that the team decided to tear down and redo most of the content. The bulk of the already written story was tossed away. What was left was maybe 6 months worth of buffer at best. As a result, the content that was supposed to roll out gradually about a year later, roughly the 1.1 to 2.0 range, had to be brought forward and slammed into the schedule to keep up with the urgent need for content updates and live ops. And because of that, everything after the big milestone 2.2 Cartithia patch was basically guaranteed to be under-detailed. At that point, perhaps the main story only existed as an overall world-building framework plus a main plot outline. What's even worse is that once you delete a huge chunk of pre-written story, things fall into a nasty feedback loop. Since all the detailed scripts aren't finished yet, every downstream team that depends on them, environments, characters, music, quest design, combat encounters, and so on, no longer has precise input. That forces main story writers to spend a ton of time that should have gone into refining the story on direct back and forth with every other department. They also have to continuously check each team's progress to keep things on track and verify that outputs from each team actually match the intended design. All of that brutally eats into their time for story refinement. So the main story not being fully fleshed out is the first reason why the narrative feels inconsistent. But that reason alone doesn't lead to the mess we're seeing now. To get there, we have to talk about the second factor. Thread B, bottom up. The software development pipeline doesn't allow it. Every now and then, I see players say 6 weeks per major patch, that dev speed is insane. Well, that's not insane, that's outright impossible. First, even just platform submissions and approvals take a lot of time. Sony's PS Store review alone can take 1 to 2 weeks. If you start from a 6-week patch cycle and knock off up to 2 weeks for PS submission, you are already down to 4 weeks. And that's not even counting the possibility of a failed submission. Leaving submission aside, there are tasks that are strictly chained in sequence. For example, you can't storyboard the main story until the script is locked. You can't record VO or build cinematic performances until the storyboards exist. On top of that, you still have to create side quests and world NPC content. After all the above resources are finished and packaged, you need to leave enough time for multiple rounds of QA. There is simply no way you can squeeze all of that into 28 days, and that's before we even talk about negotiating schedules with high-profile voice actors. For games that need regular updates but whose patch intervals are nowhere near long enough to cover the full dev cycle, the standard industry solution is to adapt and extend agile software development practices, in particular the agile release train concept. You split the overall team into multiple sub-teams, each in charge of a sub-project, and have them work in parallel under fixed rules and processes. We surely won't deep dive into software engineering theory here, so back to Wuwa. 90% of the main story was tossed away. As we mentioned above, the project's release train had to face a harsh reality. Each subpatch team started with very little main story material to lean on, and not only could they not afford to make mistakes, they also had to somehow over-deliver just to repair the game's reputation. That meant, even with incomplete input, they still had to write their patch stories as brilliantly as they could. And that is exactly what planted the seeds for inconsistencies and contradictions between different patches. When the 2.4 team kicked off, they may only have known that Christopher was running experiments in Septimond, repeatedly replaying a scene in an attempt to revive Leviathan, and that Augusta and Yuno, aside from showing up to present the awards and perform the trial, had no other scripted involvement. The 2.5 team might only have known that Frolova, Fraxidas, and Fenrico had a falling out over the gemstone under the sea, that Fenrico died, Frolova died, well, somehow, and Christopher, as Euro, walked away with the gem, winning big again. The 2.6 team might only have known that a grand hunt was initiated because of the Dark Tide anomaly, that Andrew was Augusta's childhood friend, and that Yuno vanished and was later rescued. As for whatever fancy moves Rover and Lupa pulled off in 2.4, the 2.6 team might have no idea. And if Lupa were to show up during the hunt and say nothing at all about those events, that would feel even more unnatural, which makes simply writing her out of the patch the least weird option. The 2.7 team might only have known that the journey in Paradise would descend, and it was planned that everyone will show up in the final battle. With this reconstruction in mind, let's look at some specific examples. I've already found 6 instances of narrative tearing, and I'm pretty sure we'd uncover more if we dug deeper. Evidence 1. Lupa's reaction in 2.7. In 2.7, when Lupa meets Rover again, she never mentions they stopping the Threnodin from reviving and saving Septimond in the second half of 2.4. All she says is a light line about fighting side by side in the arena. Logically, defeating the Threnodin, saving Septimond, and clearing the mystery of Mia's disappearance is way more important than winning a tournament. When you meet again, you'd absolutely start by bringing up those legendary feats, right? Yet, Lupa never touches them. This off feeling is very likely because when the 2.7 sub-team wrapped up and locked their script, all they knew from the main story outline passed down to the 2.4 team was Rover and Lupa won the championship. The whole 3 concurrent storylines piece was still under construction. So all 2.7 could safely reference was what the outline had explicitly given to 2.4. Anything beyond that was basically off limits. Evidence 2, Montali and Phasalia suddenly fighting side by side. In 2.7, the two families who have a blood feud between them can suddenly drop all grudges, help each other, and fight shoulder to shoulder. Do you realize how wild that is? At that moment, according to the 2.0 setup, everyone still believes that the Facilier family is full of heretics polluting with the Threnodin, poison-wielding murderers and lunatics, and that's just what's on the surface. According to Clota's companion story, the two families actually had a large-scale violent clash in the past, a mutual massacre. The story says Clota's words carried little weight back then, and the old grandfather was injured and couldn't command, so the family suffered massive losses. This wasn't some false accusation or Byzantine rivalry where you secretly sabotage the other side and let them lose some money. It was armed invasion and conflict. Who knows how much property was destroyed and how many people were actually killed. Even Duncan's last family member died because of that conflict. And then the Montali just opened the Alvarado vault and let the Faciliers in to take shelter? If you stick to the 2.0 setup, it would actually make more sense for them to slam the vault doors shut and treat it as a chance to wipe out all the enemies in sight. Even if they really did open the doors, the Faciliers carry the Threnodin's frequency or corruption. They would very likely be cut down by the sentry construct guarding the entrance before they even made it inside. From Clota's point of view at the finale, with the common enemy in front and you, Cantarella's performance being acceptable, I, as the head of the Montali family, will not blow you up in the face for being a cat's eye seducer. For being a Threnodin believer. That's already me being generous. How did this jump straight to fighting side by side? When I played this part, it felt incredibly jarring. This logic break is likely because at the main story outline level, it only said these two families have never gotten along. Not that they had a literal blood feud. The full-on Mafia war-style massacre might be something the 2.0 team added on their own to spice up the story. From the 2.7 team's perspective, if they are told the two families merely don't get along, not have a vendetta carved in blood, then having them support each other in the face of a greater threat and fight side by side isn't a big deal at all. But for us players, once we've already internalized the 2.0 team's blood feud setup, written like a mob movie, then this sudden mutual support and cooperation just feels way too abrupt. And the more seriously you're engaged with that earlier story, the more jarring it feels now. Evidence 3. Who is the shackle? Imperator or Cartithia? In 2.7, Imperator says, using myself to shackle it. Yet 2.2 tells us that the shackle is the resonator, the one miraculously created, Cartithia. On top of that, in 2.7, Imperator says it voluntarily chose to stop fighting Leviathan. I allowed the Threnodin to exist. I chose coexistence. But in 2.2, Imperator describes its fusion with Leviathan as something it was forced into, with no other options. So you see, 2.7 directly contradicts what we were told in 2.2. Evidence 4. When and how was the civilization capsule created? In 2.7, Imperator said that the civilization capsule has to be opened jointly by Rover and Cartithia, and that it doesn't even know whether Cartithia will truly stand with humanity. That implies that the split and creation of the capsule had to happen at some point between 38 years ago when Cartithia was born and 20 years ago when she was laureled. Why? Because before that, even the existence of a dual resonator was an open question. And after that, Cartithia is unambiguously standing with humanity against the Threnodin. This leads to two contradictions. After merging, Imperator supposedly loses control over its body and can barely safeguard its core data. Only when Cantarella surrenders her second awakening power back onto Imperator can it briefly regain control of the body. So how would he be able, at some point between 20 and 38 years ago to split off his memories, create the capsule, and somehow stash it inside the Earthrealm wedge all the way over in Septimont. Additionally, the way 2.6 Part 1 describes the Earthrealm wedge makes it sound like something that arrived centuries ago. It was not some construction that was thrown together 20 to 38 years ago, so how did that capsule get transported there? The only way to reconcile evidence 3 and 4 is to assume this. When the 2.2 and 2.7 teams started writing and up to the point where they locked their scripts, all they had from the main story framework were 3 rough concepts: the fusion and the dual resonator Cartethia, the civilization capsule, and imposing a shackle. Each team then expanded that skeleton on their own. The 2.2 team defined Cartethia's age, the timing of the second dark tide, and interpreted the shackle as Cartethia herself, writing it so that the Imperator had lost all ability to act in order to heighten the sense of crisis. The 2.7 team, by contrast, defined Imperator wants Rover and Cartethia to open the civilization capsule together, interpreted the shackle as the Imperator itself, and established that the Imperator can occasionally still move of his own will. Looked at separately, each team's logic makes sense within its own patch. Put them together, and the contradictions pop out immediately. The inconsistency doesn't just appear across patches. You can clearly see it within a single patch as well, and here's evidence 5. Returning the bracelet to Yuno is shown very differently between 2.6 Part 1 and Part 2. In Part 1, it's barely touched on. The return is more or less glossed over. In Part 2, it's portrayed in detail, complete with the ridiculously cute cat mouth faces. What does that tell us? It strongly suggests that when Part 2 was in development, none of the Part 1 material, neither the script nor the cutscenes, actually existed yet. These two parts weren't written in sequence, they were very likely developed in parallel. Both dev teams only knew Yuno wanted Rover to keep the bracelet, which later became the only clue to bring Yuno back from the chaos. Same thing happened in 2.7 as our evidence 6, Cantarella deducing Rover's corruption. Before jumping into the Dark Tide in Act 11, a lot of players noticed that Cantarella infers from Rover's words that Rover has already been corrupted by the Dark Tide, and everyone praised how understanding and considerate she was. The problem is, at the end of Act 10, when Galbrana tells Rover he's become the new harbinger of the Dark Tide, Cantarella is right there in the scene. She even immediately gave the antidote to Rover to help suppress Leviathan's spiritual corruption at the start of Act 11. This is obviously a case of parallel development inside the same patch. At the start of the development, the outline simply didn't get into these details. So when two separate teams both wanted to highlight these emotional beats, they accidentally collided. This, from another angle, shows just how hard it is to fix the tearing caused by parallel development. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, just leaving some hooks and foreshadowing, like returning the bracelet, Cantarella learns about Rover's condition earlier than anyone else and is deeply worried, is nowhere near enough. If you have multiple teams creating in parallel and each one tries to embellish things a little, it's very easy to end up crashing into each other. At this point in my research, a thought suddenly crossed my mind. Is it possible that because the main story details were missing, each subteam had to fill in the gaps themselves, and that's exactly what gave them so much room to go wild and be creative? The 2.4 team only knew that Cristoforo was doing experiments in Septimont, so they said, fine, let's do a triple threat converging narrative, and have Frolova deliver a book in a dream to help the player stitch everything together. The 2.5 team only knew the rough setup that Frolova ultimately sinks, and that Fraxidas walk away with the gem. so they decided, okay, let's do a narrative that jumps across centuries and stage a philosophical showdown about the ultimate meaning of life. Modulate the emotions of all the players into perfect synchrony, and then stab them all in one go. The 2.6 team only knew that Yuno chooses self-sacrifice, so they went all in. They don't mention this at all, burying it completely. Then in the cutscene, a single tear falls, quietly cracking open a farewell that's both heart-rending and yet violently heroic. After that, the player becomes the one and only person who can remember Yuno, who can save Yuno, who can take that little hand again as the unwritten one. By this point, our analysis is edging from reconstruction into speculation, so I'll stop here and wrap things up. The reason Wuthering Wave's story feels torn and inconsistent is this. After being forced to delete a massive amount of main story content, each subpatch team had severely insufficient input to work with. They were given only the bare trunk of the story. All the branches and leaves had to be invented and fleshed out independently by each parallel subteam. That naturally produced a lot of contradictions that cannot be perfectly stitched together. Fixing this is extremely difficult. Unless you push the main story far enough ahead and write it in exhaustive detail, there's no way to avoid problems once you hand things off to the subteams. In the mild case, a character vanishes as soon as their banner ends. In the severe case, you get outright contradictions and broken logic. But if you do write the main story in that much detail, you risk limiting how much freedom each patch team has in shaping their own storytelling and presentation. At its core, what looks like a simple story inconsistency problem is actually a process management and software engineering problem in modern game development. This isn't something you can simply fix by calling a meeting, talking big for hours, or copy-pasting some fancy framework onto the team. The existing industry playbooks for this kind of massive parallel pipelines are very likely already hitting their limits, which means Kuro might have reached the Uncharted area and have to figure out its own path. They must iterate, refine, or even invent the process, verify its output, and repeat. They need to keep different teams' outputs aligned with precision where it matters most, while still carving out as much room as possible for freedom of creativity at specific stages of the workflow. The good news is the future may still be bright. Very soon we'll be able to look at the story of 3.0 and see whether these issues have improved. I will also make new videos to talk about improvement, or well, deterioration if I find any. Again, the only reason I'm bringing this up is that I want to understand how a game I love is made, share it with everyone, and hopefully have Kuro see it and keep pushing things forward. Like all of you, I enjoyed 2.x and I'm really looking forward to 3.0, so let's wait and see together. May your pulls on Lene and morning be blessed, and see you in the next video.